Morning to receive testimony on U.S. policy and strategy in the Asia-Pacific region. I'm pleased to welcome today our panel of expert witnesses, all with deep knowledge and experience in the region. Victor Cha, who is the Senior Advisor and Korea Chair at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Aaron Friedberg, who is a Professor of Politics and International Affairs at Princeton University. Kelly Magsamen, former Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Asia and Pacific Security Affairs, and Ashley Tellis, Senior Fellow in Tata, having trouble with my enunciation this morning, I apologize. Senior Fellow in Tata, Chair for Strategic Affairs at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, an old friend of the committee. America's interests in the Asia-Pacific region are deep and enduring. That's why for the past 70 years, we've worked with our allies and partners to uphold a rules-based order based on principles of free peoples and free markets, open seas and open skies, the rule of law and the peaceful resolution of disputes. These ideas have produced unprecedented peace and prosperity in the Asia-Pacific. But now the challenges to this rules-based order are mounting, as they threaten not just the nations of the Asia-Pacific region, but the United States as well. The most immediate challenge is the situation on the Korean Peninsula. Kim Jong-un's regime has thrown its full weight behind its quest for nuclear weapons and the means to deliver them. And unfortunately, the regime is making real progress. A North Korean missile with a nuclear payload capable of striking an American city is no longer a distant hypothetical, but an imminent danger, one that poses a real and rising risk of conflict. I look forward to hearing from our witnesses today about U.S. policy options on the Korean Peninsula. For years, the United States has looked to China, North Korea's long-term patron and sole strategic ally, to bring the regime to the negotiating table and achieve progress toward a denuclearized Korean Peninsula. We have done so for the simple reason that China is the only country with the influence to curb North Koreans' destabilizing behavior. But China has repeatedly refused to exercise that influence. Instead, China has chosen to bully South Korea for exercising its sovereign right to defend itself from the escalating North Korean threat. In response to the alliance decision to deploy the THAAD missile defense system to the Korean Peninsula, China has waged a campaign of economic retaliation against South Korea, which has inflicted real damage. The twisted reality is that China is doing all of this to stop the deployment of a missile defense system, which is only necessary because China has aided and abetted North Korea for decades. I welcome the Trump administration's outreach to China on the issue of North Korea. But as these discussions continue, the United States should be clear that while we earnestly seek China's cooperation on North Korea, we do not seek such cooperation at the expense of our vital interests. We must not and will not bargain over our alliances with Japan and South Korea, nor over fundamental principles such as freedom of the seas. As its behavior towards South Korea indicates, over the last several years, China has acted less and less like a responsible stakeholder of the rules-based order in the region and more like a bully. Its rapid military modernization, provocations in the East China Sea, and continued militarization activities in the South China Sea signal an increasingly assertive pattern of behavior. Despite U.S. efforts to rebalance to the Asia-Pacific, U.S. policy has failed to adapt to the scale and velocity of China's challenge to the rules-based order. And that failure has called into question the credibility of America's security commitments in the region. The new administration has an important opportunity to chart a different and better course. For example, I believe there is strong merit for an Asia-Pacific Stability Initiative, which is similar to the European Deterrence Initiative pursued over the last few years. This initiative would enhance Pacific Command's credible combat power through targeted funding to realign U.S. military force posture in the region improve operationally relevant infrastructure, fund additional exercises, pre-position equipment and munitions, and build capacity with our allies and partners. These are important steps that should be taken as part of a new comprehensive strategy in the Asia-Pacific that incorporates all elements of national power. I hope our witnesses will describe their ideas about what an APSI should fund and how they would articulate an interagency strategy for the Asia-Pacific. Thank all the witnesses for being here today, and I look forward to your testimony. Senator Reid.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, for calling this very important hearing, and thank you to all the witnesses for agreeing to testify this morning. This hearing could not come at a more critical time as the North Korean regime has engaged in an aggressive schedule of tests for its nuclear and missile programs. I look forward to hearing from our witnesses on whether they believe China can and will exert sufficient pressure on the regime to denuclearize the peninsula. If not, what are the alternatives? Is a military strike something we should consider given the uncertainty regarding the possible scope and nature of retaliation from the regime? I would also like to hear whether there are feasible military options on the table and how we should coordinate those options with our allies in the region. We have also heard concern from our allies and partners in the region that the administration has not yet articulated a comprehensive Asia-Pacific strategy. For example, what is the administration's maritime strategy to deal with excessive unlawful maritime claims? How will it balance our military presence with economic engagement to counter the narrative that China is the economic partner of choice? And most important, how will it balance cooperation and competition with China, especially given the importance of China's cooperation in issues ranging from North Korea to terrorism? Mr. Chairman, again, thank you for holding this important hearing. I look forward to hearing the testimony of the witnesses on all of these issues and more. Thank you.
Before I call on the witnesses, we have a housekeeping. I'd just like to say, what's that? All right, we just lost one, so we'll wait. Dr. Cha, welcome.
Thank you, Chairman McCain, Ranking Member Reid, and distinguished members of the committee. So there used to be a time when North Korea and their actions were considered isolated acts by a lonely dictator who was harmless and just looking for some attention with really bad hair. I don't think people think that way anymore. Between 1994 and 2008, North Korea did 16 ballistic missile tests and 1 nuclear test. Since January of 2009, they have done 71 missile tests, including 4 nuclear tests. The leader in North Korea has made no effort to have dialogue with any other country in the region, not just the United States, but that includes China, South Korea, Russia. Absolutely no interest in talking. All of this translates to one of the most challenging strategic environments for the United States and its allies, and a very dark strategic cloud that is starting to dominate the skyline with regard to East Asia. Having said that, I think there's a silver lining to every dark cloud, and in this case, I think there are 4 that could help to inform an Asia-Pacific security initiative, as the Chairman mentioned. First, the North Korean threat provides opportunity for closer coordination of policy between the next government in South Korea, which will be elected May 9th, and Washington. New South Korean government cannot afford ideological indulgences in a renewed engagement or sunshine policy. It would be unwise, for example, for a new South Korean president on May 10th, presumably in the aftermath of more North Korean provocations and possibly a 6th nuclear test, to declare that he or she is reopening the Kaesong industrial complex. This would only serve to further marginalize South Korea's strategic position, as the new government would lose step with the United States, Japan, and even China. The U.S. is not averse to inter-Korean engagement. However, for it to be effective, such engagement must be used strategically and coordinated with an overall U.S. ROK strategy for negotiations and denuclearization. The second silver lining has to do with trilateral coordination. The United States should welcome an early meeting with the U.S. President and South Korea and Japan, presumably before President Trump's scheduled trip to the region in the fall. The goal of alliance coordination should be a collective security statement among the three allies, the United States, Japan, and Korea, that an attack on one constitutes an attack against all. The third silver lining relates to China. Beijing is unlikely to let off on the economic pressure on South Korea over the THAAD defense system for, I think, at least another 1 or 2 financial quarters. This will hurt South Korean businesses and tourism even more, but it should also spark serious thinking, strategic thinking in the United States and South Korea about reducing the ROK's economic dependence on China. Given the energy revolution in the United States and the removal of export restrictions, the two allies should think seriously about new bilateral energy partnerships that could reduce South Korean energy dependence on China and the Middle East. Washington and Seoul's policy planning offices can work together to map out a South Korean strategy for engaging India, as well as ASEAN countries. These new engagements should not be a temporary measure, but should be a serious effort at creating new markets for U.S. allies, products, production chains, and investment. The Chinese have proven with their coercion over the THAAD issue that South Korea's future welfare cannot be left in Chinese hands. Finally, the United States should encourage a new government in South Korea to take a stronger stand in supporting public goods off the Korean peninsula in neighboring waters. In particular, as part of a new engagement strategy with ASEAN, the U.S., with the support of South Korea, could show stronger will to discourage further militarization of the South China Sea. This would win partners among ASEAN countries and be a distinctly positive platform for the United States and its allies in the region. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Committee consider a list of 5,550 pending military nominations. All these nominations have been before the committee the required length of time. Is there a motion to favorably report these 5,550 military nominations to the Senate? Is there a second? All in favor say aye. The motion carries. Dr. Friedberg, welcome.
Senator McCain, Senator Reed, thank you very much, members of the committee. I appreciate very much the opportunity to express my views on these important subjects. In the time available, I'd like to try to make 3 main points. First, as Senator McCain, I think, has already indicated, I don't think the United States currently has a coherent, integrated national strategy for the Asia-Pacific region, and in particular, it lacks a strategy for dealing with an increasingly powerful and assertive China. What we have instead are the remnants of a strategy first put in place over 2 decades ago. Some aspirational goals and a set of policies and programs intended to achieve them that are now in varying states of disrepair and which are, in any event, largely disconnected from one another. Second, China does have such a strategy, not only for the Asia-Pacific, but for the continental domain along its land frontiers. The goal of Beijing's strategy, as has become increasingly clear in the last few years, is to create a regional Eurasian order that's very different from the one we've been trying to build since the end of the Cold War. And third, just because Beijing has a strategy doesn't mean it'll succeed. China has many weaknesses and liabilities. We and our allies have many strengths. But I do think we've reached the point where it's essential that we re-examine our goals, review our strategy, and adjust our policies accordingly. And the start of a new administration would naturally be the time to attempt such review. It simply becomes more difficult as time goes on and more issues accumulate. Let me try to expand on each of those points. When the Cold War ended, the United States set out to expand the geographic scope of the Western liberal economic and institutional order by integrating the pieces of the former Soviet Union and the former Soviet Empire, and by accelerating the integration of China, a process that had begun a few years before. As regards China, the United States pursued a 2-pronged strategy, on the one hand seeking to engage China across all domains, economic in particular, but diplomatic and others, and at the same time working with our allies and partners and maintaining our own forces in the region to preserve a balance of power that was favorable to our interests and to the security of our allies. And the goals of that policy were to preserve stability, to deter the possibility of aggression, while waiting for engagement to work its magic. The U.S. hoped, in effect, to tame and ultimately to transform China, to encourage its leaders to see their interests as lying in the preservation of that order, and to set in motion processes that would lead eventually to the economic and political liberalization of that country. As in Europe, so also in Asia, our ultimate aim was to build a region whole and free, an open, liberal region in an open and liberal world. Since the turn of the century, it's become increasingly apparent that this approach hasn't worked, at least not yet. Engagement has not achieved its intended results. China is obviously far stronger, far richer, but it's more repressive domestically than at any time since the Cultural Revolution. It continues to rely heavily on mercantilist economic policies that impose costs on other countries, including ours. And its external behavior has become increasingly assertive, even aggressive, most notably, but not entirely, in the maritime domain. And meanwhile, engagement not working, balancing has become more difficult for us and for our allies because of the growth of China's military capabilities. So second, what accounts for this recent shift in Chinese behavior? The short answer to that question is that Beijing's increased assertiveness is driven by a mix of optimism and even arrogance on the one hand, and also deep insecurity. For roughly the first 15 years or so after the end of the Cold War, China's rulers followed the wisdom of Deng Xiaoping, who advised in 1991 that China should hide its capabilities and bide its time, avoid confrontation, build up all the elements of its national power, and advance cautiously towards eventually achieving a position reestablishing China as a preponderant power in the region. Things began to change in 2008 with the onset of the financial crisis, and these changes have accelerated and become institutionalized since 2013 with the accession of Xi Jinping to top positions in the party and the state than had been expected, and that China was therefore able to rise more quickly than had been hoped. It was time then for China to step up, to become clearer in defining its core interests, and more assertive in pursuing them. At the same time, however, the crisis also deepened the Chinese leadership's underlying concerns about their prospects for sustaining economic growth and preserving social stability. So China is behaving more assertively, both because its leaders want to seize the opportunities presented to them by what they see as a more favorable external situation, and because they feel the need to bolster their legitimacy and to rally domestic support by courting controlled confrontations with others whom they can present as hostile foreign forces, including Japan and the United States. China's actions aren't limited to pursuing its claims and trying to extend its zone of effective control in the maritime domain. Along its land frontiers, Beijing has also unveiled a hugely ambitious set of infrastructure development plans, the so-called One Belt, One Road initiative, which aims to transform the economic and strategic geography of much of Eurasia. China's leaders have begun to articulate their vision for a new Eurasian order, a system of infrastructure networks, regional free trade areas, new rules written in Beijing, and mechanisms for political consultation, all with China at the center and the United States pushed to the periphery, if not out of the region altogether. In this vision, U.S. alliances would either be dissolved or drained of their significance. Maritime democracies would be divided from one another and relatively weak, and China, meanwhile, would be surrounded on the continent by friendly and subservient authoritarian regimes. So if in the 20th century the United States tried to make the world safe for democracy, in the 21st, China is trying to make the world safe for authoritarianism, or at least it's trying to make Asia safe for continued Communist Party rule of China. And they're using and trying to coordinate all the instruments of policy to achieve these ends. Military domain, building up both conventional so-called anti-access area denial capabilities, and they're modernizing their nuclear forces in order to deter possible U.S. intervention and to raise questions about the continued viability of our security guarantees, and also developing other instruments, lawfare, the Little Blue Men, maritime militia, island construction, to advance towards their goals, create facts without provoking confrontation. Economically, they've been using the growing gravitational pull of their economy to draw others towards them. And also, they've become increasingly open in using economic threats and punishments to try to shape the behavior of others in the region, including U.S. allies, as Dr. Cha mentioned, Korea and also the Philippines. And China has been engaging in what Chinese strategists refer to as political warfare, attempts to shape the perceptions of both leaders and elites and publics by conveying the message that China's growing wealth and power present an opportunity rather
would be tantamount to strategic malpractice. So I agree with Aaron on his comments earlier about the need for a big look at our China strategy. I do not mean to suggest that we should enter a new Cold War with China, nor can we cast aside areas of cooperation that benefit our interests. But we need to be clear-eyed about our long-term interest in preserving the American position, and that should be our North Star. To do so, the United States needs to invest in our comparative strengths and, by extension, our credibility. We need to get our own house in order to address this pure scale, as the chairman mentioned, of this challenge. Necessary budget investments, human capital investments, which is something that is not talked about enough, and overall strategy. And we need to move to the next phase of increasing U.S. presence, posture, and capabilities in the region. And that next phase is going to be a lot harder. In this regard, I'd like to thank you, Chairman McCain, for your idea and proposal on the Asia-Pacific Stability Initiative, which I hope the Trump administration will support. It will not only improve our ability to fight and win wars, it will improve our ability to keep the peace. This brings me to the third challenge, an enduring and persistent one, which is terrorism in the region. I think in the emergence of ISIL, the terrorist threat in South and Southeast Asia is evolving. And the bottom line here is we need to get ahead of it. And we have time to get ahead of it. So we need to take more preventive action on terrorism in South and Southeast Asia. So let me talk briefly about opportunities which tend to get lost in all of the noise. First, I'd say the biggest strategic opportunity is India. And here, the United States and India increasingly share a common strategic outlook on the Asia-Pacific, especially a mutual concern over Chinese military modernization and adventurism. But the question here is, can we reach a new level of cooperation to place limits on Chinese ambition? I believe it is possible, but only if the United States and India together persist in overcoming the suspicions of the past and build stronger habits of actual cooperation. And this is going to require the U.S. and Indian systems, which are not naturally compatible, to demonstrate mutual flexibility as well as ambition. The second opportunity, which is a near-term and high-reward opportunity, is Southeast Asia. As the chairman knows, the demand signal in Southeast Asia for U.S. defense engagement is on the rise, and we need to meet it. And while we can do more through defense engagement, we also need to do more on diplomatic, economic, commercial, private sector engagement in Southeast Asia. Whether it's in Vietnam or Burma or Sri Lanka, there are countless opportunities for the United States to build strategic depth in Southeast Asia. ASEAN also needs to be central to our strategy, and I would recommend Secretary Mattis continue efforts of his last two predecessors to host the ASEAN defense ministers in the United States at the earliest opportunity. Finally, this committee's leadership on Southeast Asia has been essential, whether it was by your engagement every year at the Shangri-La Dialogue, which is an important expression of American bipartisan commitment to the Asia-Pacific, or whether it was following through with action, as in the case of the Southeast Asia Maritime Security Initiative, a much-needed, timely inject of American effort to fill a critical capacity gap. Finally, the big one, the long-term strategy, the real opportunity for the United States. To retain our primacy, the United States needs to weave together its disparate security and economic efforts into a broader strategy. We need to fashion a networked security architecture with allies and partners to help all of us do more over greater distances with greater economy of effort, undergirded by a shared set of principles in support of a rules-based order. We need to present a vision for an equivalent economic architecture that promotes sustainable and inclusive economic growth and opportunity for all countries, including the United States. In the absence of meaningful American economic statecraft in the region, China is filling the void. And that has dangerous implications for our relationships, setting up false choices for our allies between their security and their prosperity. Besides these strategic implications, the lack of a serious U.S. economic initiative in Asia will leave average Americans at a long-term economic disadvantage. So in sum, the challenges and the opportunities for the United States are significant, but without urgent American leadership and the requisite whole-of-government investment, the United States will not be able to rise to them. And decades of relative peace and prosperity that American leadership has enabled are at risk. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Senator McCain. Good morning. Thank you, Ranking Member Reid and members of the committee, for inviting me to testify this morning on the challenges facing the United States in the Indo-Pacific. I have submitted a longer statement. I would be grateful if that is entered into the record. In my oral remarks this morning, I want to highlight 5 themes drawn from my written statement. First, the challenges posed by North Korea and China obviously remain the most dangerous problems facing the United States in the Indo-Pacific. The challenges emanating from North Korea are obviously real, dangerous, and in the near term. The challenges emanating from China are long-term, enduring, and aimed fundamentally at decoupling the United States from its Asian partners. In my remarks this morning, I want to focus primarily on China, and I want to thank my colleagues Victor Cha and Kelly Maximon for spending time on speaking about the issues relating to North Korea. The first point I want to make in this connection is that as we think about China as a strategic competitor, it is important not to think of China as merely a regional power, but increasingly as a global challenger to the United States. China is already a great power in Pacific Asia. It is increasingly active militarily in the Indian Ocean. It is seeking facilities in the Mediterranean and along the African coasts. And within a couple of decades, the size of Chinese naval capabilities will begin to rival those of our own. And it is likely that China will begin to maintain a presence both in the Atlantic and in the Arctic Oceans as well. So we've got to think of China in a new way, not just simply as an Asian power, but as a global power. The second point I want to make is that it becomes increasingly important for the United States, as it deals with the emerging Chinese challenge, to reaffirm its own commitment to maintaining its traditional preeminence both globally and in the Indo-Pacific. The U.S. commitment to this preeminence is now uncertain in Asia. The Asian states are uncertain about whether Washington can be counted on to balance against China's quest for regional hegemony, and whether Washington can be lured away from the attractions of condominium with China, a condominium which might threaten the security of our friends. The president, therefore, should use the opportunity offered by his appearance at the East Asia Summit to clearly affirm America's commitment to maintaining its global primacy. But words alone are not enough. I think it would be very helpful for the administration to support your initiative, Senator McCain, with respect to the Asia-Pacific Stability Initiative. In fact, urging funding at levels that approximate those offered for the European Reassurance Initiative. Third, the resources that I believe should be allocated to the Indo-Pacific should focus increasingly on restoring the effectiveness of U.S. power projection, because that capability has been undermined considerably by China's recent investments in anti-access and area denial. In the near term, this will require shifting additional combat power to the theater, remedying shortfalls in critical munitions, expanding logistics capabilities, increasing joint exercises and training, and improving force resiliency by enabling a more dispersed deployment posture. But the longer term is just as crucial, and the demands of the longer term cannot be avoided indefinitely. Here, I believe bipartisan support will be necessary for developing and rapidly integrating various revolutionary technologies into the joint force. Technologies that will emphasize stealth, long-range, and unmanned capabilities, as well as doubling down on our advantages in undersea warfare. Fourth, building better capabilities alone will not suffice for effective power projection. if the United States lacks the will to protect the international regime that serves our strategic interests. An important element of that regime, protecting the freedom of navigation, is now at serious risk because of China's activities in the South China Sea. It's time for Washington to push back on these efforts by undertaking regular freedom of navigation operations in much the same way as we do sensitive reconnaissance operations in the Indo-Pacific today. These operations should be regular, unpublicized, undertaken at the discretion of PACOM, and should not be constrained by the promise of Chinese good behavior on other issues. Fifth and finally, we will not be able to tame Chinese power in the Indo-Pacific without strengthening our friends and alliance partners, a point made quite clearly by Kelly in her remarks before me. There are diverse initiatives that are required for success on this count. I'll just flag a few. The United States should first begin to seriously think about working with its partners to replicate China's own anti-access and area denial capabilities. In effect, replicating mini A2AD bubbles throughout the Indo-Pacific to constrain China's freedom of maneuver around the littorals. The United States cannot afford to put off the aid and enhanced training to Taiwan for very much longer, just as we ought to urge Taipei to move expeditiously with respect to increasing its own military spending and reforming its own concepts of military operations. As a matter of national policy, we should affirm our strong support for trilateral cooperation between Japan, India, and Australia, whether or not the United States is party to these activities. As Kelly emphasized, we should not give up on the nations of Southeast Asia either. They are currently at the receiving end of Chinese assertiveness, and therefore, our theater engagement plan is something that we need to reinvest in because it gives us the opportunity to provide critical reassurance to the smaller Southeast Asian states in ways that will limit the potential for Chinese intimidation. And finally, we need to reinvigorate the balancing of China by doubling down on our strategic partnership with India. This is no longer simply a political necessity. It is an urgent operational necessity as well. As Chinese military activities in the Indian Ocean begin to gather steam, the partnership with India becomes even more important because of the limits it can impose on China's freedom of action in the Indian Ocean, and thereby limiting the burdens on U.S. forward defense in other parts of the Indo-Pacific. In short, managing the rise of Chinese military power will be the most difficult challenge that the United States faces in the Indo-Pacific over the longer term. Managing that challenge will be demanding, but we have no choice but to be resolute in doing so, because our security, our international standing, and the well-being of our allies is at stake. Thank you very much for inviting me this morning, and I look forward to answering your questions.
Thank you very much. Dr. Tillis, would the witnesses agree that the abandonment of TPP was one of the biggest mistakes we have made? Dr. Shah?
Yes, I think I saw TPP as not just being a trade agreement, but having broader strategic implications. It's one of the three legs that the United States stands on in Asia, in addition to our military presence and our values. So it's quite unfortunate, yes.
Dr. Friedberg?
I agree. In addition to the harmful effects of not going forward with the agreement, the signal that it sent, I think, was deeply damaging. So the fact that we placed such emphasis on it, talked about it, tried to persuade others to do it, encouraged others, including, I think, in particular, our friends and allies in Japan, to go out on limbs themselves to try to persuade their legislatures to accept this agreement, and then pulled the rug out. Really a perfect storm, it seems to me, and very damaging. And it's going to take a while, I think, to work our way back from that setback.
Yes, because a Sino-centric economic order in Asia is not in our interests. So yes, I agree it was a disaster. It's also actually having practical effects on our security. It's making it harder for us to engage with countries about access agreements because the Chinese are in there essentially lining the pockets and promising lots of investments in infrastructure, et cetera. So it's making our job on the defense side a lot harder.
I agree completely with my fellow panelists. It was both unfortunate, our withdrawal from TPP was both unfortunate and dangerous, and I would flag 3 reasons for this. First, the business of Asia is business. If we cannot engage in matters that are really important to the Asian states, enhancing their own prosperity, our ability to enhance their security will also be diminished. That's point number 1. Point number 2, we really cannot cede to the Chinese the ability to create new rules for trade in Asia. TPP offered us the opportunity to create gold standard rules, and we've now divested ourselves of that opportunity. 3, between TTP and TPIP, there was every promise that we could add close to 1% to US GDP growth through trade. Even if you believe in America first, you do need to find ways of enhancing our global growth, and trade offers us that great opportunity.
Right now, we have increasing tensions, as we all know, between us and North Korea, with the most unstable ruler that they have had, and the testing of nuclear weapons, I think, as Dr. Cha pointed out, and missile capability is dramatically escalated. Yet at the same time, we have North Korean artillery in place at a degree where at least they could launch one attack that would strike Seoul, a city of 25 million people, as I recall. And obviously, the key to some of this is China. And China had taken some very small steps as far as coal is concerned, but they have never taken any real steps to restrain North Korean activity. So it seems to me that we are in probably one of the most challenging situations since the Cuban Missile Crisis in some respects. Certainly not exact parallels, but maybe it rhymes a bit. Dr. Cha?
I think that's a very accurate assessment of the situation. There is nothing that I see that suggests North Korea is going to slow down the pace of its testing. In fact, I think it's going to increase given the elections in South Korea. China still subsidizes, even if they cut coal, they still subsidize 85% of North Korea's external trade. So China is definitely part of the solution in trying to stop North Korea, but it's also part of the problem, as you suggest, in that they are not willing to really put the sort of pressure that will impose economic costs on North Korea for going down this path.
China's been playing a game with us for at least 15 years on this issue. When we get especially concerned about what the North Koreans are doing, and we go to the Chinese and ask them for their help, what they've done in the past is to apply limited increments of pressure. They did it in 2003 to get the North Koreans to agree to sit down what became six-party talks. But at the same time, almost simultaneously, as Victor suggests, they're enabling the North Korean regime to continue by allowing continued economic exchange across their border. The Chinese have also allowed, or the Chinese authorities have at least looked aside as Chinese-based companies have exported to North Korea components that were essential to the development of their ballistic missiles and probably other parts of their special weapons programs. I'm not at all optimistic that the Chinese are going to play a different game with us now than they did in the past. One thing I would add, though, aside from military pressure, which for reasons that you suggest, Senator McCain, is, I think, of questionable plausibility, there are ways in which we could increase economic pressure on the North Korean regime, particularly by imposing further economic sanctions and especially financial sanctions. We did that in the Bush administration. I think it was actually something that caused a good deal of pain. We backed away from it for various reasons. I think it was a mistake to have done that. One of the reasons, in my understanding, that we haven't been willing to push on this harder is that it probably would involve sanctioning entities that are based in China. And I think we've been reluctant to do that because of our concerns about upsetting the relationship with China. I think if we're going to be serious about this, we probably are going to have to go down that road.
Military option being extremely challenging.
Yes. When I was in government in 2003, 2005. At that time, my understanding was it really was not, there was no way of dealing with the conventional counter-deterrent that the North Koreans had. I don't have any reason to think that it's gotten better. Moreover, the targets, the nuclear targets themselves have become more numerous. North Koreans are starting to develop mobile ballistic missiles. The problem of preempting or attacking in a preventive way and destroying North Korean nuclear capabilities is only getting worse, I would think, and nothing really has been done to deal with the conventional threat to South Korea.
Ms. Magson.
I agree on the China front. I think there are going to be limits to what they're going to be willing to do. Their biggest fear, of course, is destabilizing the peninsula. Now is the time to try to make China understand that the status quo is worse for them than all other scenarios. And to do that, I think we need to hold their interests at risk. And what I mean by that is somewhat of what Dr. Freeberg said, which is we need to really think hard about secondary sanctions on Chinese banks. I actually think we should go out and do it now. I don't think we should actually wait. I don't think that holding it in abeyance is actually going to induce Chinese cooperation. So now is the time to demonstrate to China that we're serious in that regard.
By the way, I agree with the witnesses about the importance of the U.S.-India relationship, which is something that I think has enormous potential as well. Dr. Tellis.
I concur with what has been said before on the challenges with North Korea. I think China has to make a strategic decision. If the current status quo serves its interests, and it seems to, because it immunizes China from the threat of chaos, it provides a buffer between a U.S. military presence and the Chinese border. So if this status quo continues to advance Chinese interests, there is a small likelihood that they will be more helpful to us with respect to managing North Korea. So the issue for decision in China is whether the Trump administration's increased pressure might change the game sufficiently that the threat of war becomes real enough for China to move. And to that degree, I think creating this head of steam, which the administration seems to be making an effort towards, would actually be helpful because it might motivate the Chinese to cross lines they haven't crossed before.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for your excellent testimony. Dr. Char, just a quick point. You suggest that at the conclusion of the election that whoever emerges victorious will take a harder line on the North Koreans. They won't open up the facility across the border. By the rhetoric, because some impressions we're getting is that it's a race to who's the most sensitive to the issues, not the most bellicose.
Thank you for the question. I think certainly the political spectrum has shifted in Korea during this 7-month impeachment crisis further to the left, or left of center, if you will, and the leading candidates all seem to espouse views that call for more engagement with North Korea. But I think that often what is said in campaigns is very different from when the individual takes office on the first day.
You've noticed.
Yeah. And I think in the case of South Korea, they will find that they will be in a position where their primary ally, the United States, is not of a similar mind. Neither is the partner across the sea, Japan, and arguably China is not in that position as well. And so while I don't think engagement is necessarily completely wrong with North Korea, but now is not the time. And when I was in government, we were dealing with a progressive government in South Korea. We fully respected the fact that they were interested in engaging with North Korea, but there was a right time for it and a wrong time for it. not just by U.S. policy preference, but by what would be deemed effective engagement. And I think the previous government understood that, and I would imagine that the next government in South Korea would as well.
Let me ask you all a question. I'll begin with Dr. Telesco this way. There's deep skepticism that the Chinese will apply economic pressure of a significant degree to compel changes in behavior. A variation on that is, even if they did, do you believe that the North Korean regime would abandon their missile programs and the nuclear programs?
I do not believe that to be the case. I believe the North Korean regime will continue to persist with its nuclear program because it sees that as indispensable to its own survival. And I also do not believe that China will exert the kind of pressure required to force the North Korean regime to make those fundamental changes.
So that leaves us at what point in the future?
We essentially have to prepare for a North Korean capability that will ultimately range the United States. And if it comes to that point, we have only one of two choices. We continue to hope in the reliability of deterrence, which is dangerous because of the unpredictability of this regime, or we will be forced into military actions, which will be extremely costly and painful.
Ms. Magnuson.
No, I don't think Kim Jong-un is going to voluntarily give up his nuclear weapons, even with significant Chinese pressure. I also agree that the Chinese aren't going to go as far as we need them to go to make that strategic choice. Where that leaves us is essentially what I said earlier, which is after increasing the pressure, running the China play, we do need to think carefully about whether or not we should proceed with a diplomatic effort to limit the program as best we can. Because I think we are going to face a very stark choice at some point in the future, probably in the next 5 years, about an ICBM, reaching the United States. And that's going to present some pretty stark choices. So I think our challenge now is to find a way to avoid having to make that choice at the end.
Dr. Freeberg, please.
I don't think, first, that the Chinese will apply all of the pressure that they could conceivably apply. And in part for that reason, I don't think it's likely that the North Korean regime would agree to give up their programs. It seemed to me that some years ago, it might have been possible to put the leadership in a position where we could make them an offer they couldn't refuse, where they really felt that their own personal survival was at stake. I think we're past that point. And so I agree with both my colleagues on 2 points. One, the question now, it seems to me, is are there things we can do, working with China perhaps, to try to slow down the progress of the North Korean program? So if they don't test as often as they have tested, presumably that will make it more difficult for them eventually to field a reliable capability, testing both weapons and missiles. It's not inconceivable, I think, that the Chinese might join with us in applying sufficient pressure to try to slow that down. I think that's the best we can hope for. Then the question is, how do we prepare to defend against this? There is, in the long run, I hesitate to use this term because it's fallen into disfavor for good and bad reasons, but the ultimate solution to this problem is regime change. Unless and until there's a change in the character of the North Korean regime and certainly the identity of the current leadership, there's absolutely no prospect that I can see that this problem will get better. I don't think there's any active way in which we can promote that, but we ought to think about what conditions might lead eventually to that kind of change.
Dr. Cha, finally.
I agree with my colleagues. I don't think Chinese pressure will necessarily stop North Korea's program, but I think what Chinese pressure can do is force the North Koreans back to the negotiating table. The theory of the case of that is, I think, in 2003, when China temporarily cut off oil, the North Koreans agreed to the six-party talks. And then again in 2007, when the Treasury Department undertook actions that led to a seizure of North Korean assets in a bank in China, that clearly put a lot of pressure on the regime, and they came back to implement an agreement. So I think there is precedent there. I entirely agree with my colleagues that I'm not sure how much China is willing to put that kind of pressure on North Korea, but one could argue that the situation is a little different now because the Chinese are desperate for some sort of diplomacy to take place. They really don't understand what President Trump, and they feel they have no control over North Korea, so they may be more receptive than they were in the past.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Let me, first of all, these hearings are very significant. We get people like you, and there's no more qualified panel we could have to advise us and to reflect on it. But also, these are public meetings, and I see the other value is to informing the public of things that we assume up here they already know about. And I'd like to concentrate on just the North Korea, because I've always had this bias that that's where really the serious problem is. We're talking about two things here. We're talking about their development in the technology over a period of time in developing a bomb, a weapon, and then secondly, a delivery system. And just real quickly, let me run over that. In the delivery system, North Korea goes all the way back to the 1970s. In the 1970s, they had the Scud-B, and everybody remembers that, and then they forgot that for a couple of decades. Along came 1990, the first Nodong missile test fire range was 1,300 kilometers. Then a few years later, in 2006, the test fires of the Taepodong-2 with long-range missile that was had the capability of traveling 15,000 miles, then firing the Taepodong-2 missile, which they said was satellite launch. December of 2012, North Korea launches a rocket that puts the first satellite into space. We've watched their progress all the way through to 2016. North Korea launches a solid fuel ballistic missile from a submarine. And then lastly, Kim Jong-un declares that North Korea is in its final stage in preparations to test an intercontinental ballistic missile. And you see what they've done in that period of time. I have to almost conclude that the guy really means it when he comes out with a statement. But then going back to the bomb, in 2006, we had an explosion that was 1 kiloton. In 2009, that was up to 2 kilotons. 2013 went to a third nuclear test, was an atomic bomb with an estimated explosion of 6 to 7 kilotons. And then finally, September 9th of 2016, as the fifth and latest nuclear test registered 5.3 in magnitude with an explosive yield estimated between 10 and 30 kilotons, which is about the same as it was in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and 10 times stronger than what North Korea was able to do 10 years before. So you've gone over that period of time. When we talk to the military, and we will have them in on Thursday, I understand, I know that they'll say that the two big problems that distinguish the threat that comes from North Korea from other threats is that, first of all, you're talking about a mentally deranged guy who's making the decisions, and secondly, this country has been more consistent in both developing its weapon and the delivery system, and come to the conclusion that, as I've come to, that I believe that there's an argument that could pose the greatest threat to the United States. And I'd like to just kind of get a response, if you would, Dr. Cha, to that. First of all, are we accurate in terms of that technological development over that period of time, and does that relate to the threat?
Accurate in terms of a systematic plan by the North Koreans over the past decades to develop a capability that seeks to threaten the U.S. homeland. I think there is no doubt about it that that is what they are after. As I mentioned earlier, they have done 71 of these tests since 2009, which is a step increase from what we've seen in the past. They've done 7 tests since the election of our current president. They have over 700 Scud missiles, 200 to 300 Nodong missiles, and the pace of their development and the history of development shows that they want to be able not just to field one missile that could potentially range the United States, but a whole slew of them. So this is a very proximate threat. You're absolutely right, Senator.
Yeah. Any other comments on that?